The vampire sat back, a slight frown on his face. How pathetic is it to describe these things which can't truly be described, he said, his voice low, almost to a whisper. The boy sat as if frozen. I saw nothing but that light. Then, as I drew blood, and then this next thing was sound. A dull roar at first, and then a pounding, like the pounding of a drum, growing louder and louder, as if some enormous creature were coming up on one slowly through a dark and alien forest, pounding as he came, a huge drum, and then there came the pounding of another drum, as if another giant were coming yards behind him, and each giant, intent on his own drum, gave no notice to the rhythm of the other. The sound grew louder and louder until it seemed to fill not just my hearing, but all my senses, to be throbbing in my lips and fingers, in the flesh of my temples, in my veins. All, above all, in my veins. Drum, and then the other drum, and then Lestat pulled his wrist free suddenly, and I opened my eyes and checked myself in a moment of reaching for his wrist, grabbing it, forcing it back to my mouth at all costs. I checked myself because I realized that the drum was my heart, and the second drum had been his. The vampire sighed. Do you understand? The boy began to speak, and then he shook his head. No. I do, he said. Of course, said the vampire, looking away. Wait, said the boy in a welter of excitement. The tape, it's almost gone. I have to turn it over. The vampire watched patiently as he changed it. What happened then? The boy asked. His face was moist, and he wiped it hurriedly with his handkerchief. I saw as a vampire, said the vampire, his voice now slightly detached. It seemed almost distracted. Then he drew himself up again. Lestat was standing again at the foot of the stairs, and I saw him as I could not possibly have seen him before. He seemed white, to me before starkly white, so that in the night he was almost luminous, and now I saw him filled with his own life and his own blood. He was radiant, not luminous, and then I saw not only Lestat had changed, but all things had changed. It was as if I had only just been able to see colors and shapes for the first time. I was so enthralled with the buttons on Lestat's black coat that I looked at nothing else for a long time. Then Lestat began to laugh, and I heard his laughter as if I had never heard anything before. His heart I still heard like the beating of a drum, and now came this metallic laughter. It was confusing, each sound running into the next sound like the mingling reverberations of bells, until I learned to separate the sounds. And then they overlapped, each soft but distinct, increasing but discreet peals of laughter. The vampire smiled with delight. Peals of bells. Stop looking at my buttons, Lestat said. Go out there and to the trees, rid yourself of all the human waste in your body, and don't fall so madly in love with the night that you lose your way. That, of course, was a wise command. When I saw the moon on the flagstones, I became so enamored with it that I must have spent an hour there. I passed my brother's oratory without so much as a thought of him, and standing among the cottonwood and oaks, I heard the night as if I I had never heard them. As if it were a chorus of whispering women, all beckoning me to their breasts. As for my body, it was not yet totally converted, and as soon as I became at least accustomed to the sounds and sights, it began to ache. All my human fluids were being forced out of me. I was dying as a human, yet completely alive as a vampire, and with my awakened senses, I had to preside over the death of my body with a certain discomfort and then finally fear. I ran back up the steps of the parlor where Lestat was already at work on the plantation papers, going over the expenses and profits for the last year. "You're a rich man," he said to me when I came in. "Something's happening to me," I shouted. "You're dying, that's all. Don't be a fool. Don't you have any oil lamps? All this money and you cannot afford whale oil except for that lantern. Bring me that lantern." "Dying," I shouted. "Dying?" "It happens to everyone," he persisted, refusing to help me. As I look back on this, I still despise him for it. Not because I was afraid, but because he might have drawn my attention to these changes with reverence. He might have calmed me and told me that I might watch my death with the same fascination with which I had watched and felt the night, but he didn't. Lestat was never the vampire I am. Not at all. The vampire did not say this boastfully. He said it as if he would truly have had it otherwise. "Alors," he said. He sighed. I was dying fast, which meant that my capacity for fear was diminishing rapidly. I simply regret I was not more attentive to the process. Lestat was being a perfect idiot. "Oh, for the love of hell," he began shouting. "Do you realize I've made no provision for you? What a fool I am," I was tempted to say. "Yes, you are, but I didn't. You'll have to bed down with me this morning. I haven't prepared you a coffin." The vampire laughed. The coffin struck me with such a chord of terror in me, I think it absorbed all the capacity of terror I had left. Then came only a mild alarm at having to share a coffin with Lestat. He was in my father's bedroom, meantime. Telling the old man goodbye and that he would return in the morning. "But where do you go? Why must you live by such a schedule?" the old man demanded. And Lestat became impatient. Before this, he had been gracious to the old man, almost to the point of sickening. But now he became a bully. "I take care of you, don't I? I have put a better roof over your head than you ever put over mine. If I want to sleep all day and drink all night, I'll do it, damn you." The old man started to whine. Only my peculiar state of emotions and most unusual feeling of exhaustion kept me from disapproving. I was watching the scene through the open door, enthralled with the colors of the counterpane and the positive riot of color in the old man's face. His blue veins pulsed beneath his pink and grayish flesh. I found even the yellow of his teeth appealing to me, and I became almost hypnotized by the quivering of his lip. Such a son, he said, never suspecting, of course, the true nature of his son. "All right, then go. I know you keep a woman somewhere. You go see her as soon as her husband leaves in the morning. Give me my rosary." "What's happened to my rosary?" Lestat said something blasphemous and gave him the rosary. "But," the boy started. "Yes?" said the vampire. "I'm afraid I don't allow you enough questions." "I was going to ask, rosaries have crosses on them, don't they?" "Oh, the rumor about crosses," the vampire laughed. "You ever to our being afraid of crosses. Unable to look on them, I thought, said the boy. Nonsense, my friend, sheer nonsense. I can look on anything I like, and I rather like looking on crucifixes in particular. And what about the rumor about keyholes? That you can become steam and go through them? I wish I could, laughed the vampire. How positively delightful. I should like to pass through all manner of different keyholes and feel the tickle of the peculiar shapes. No, he shook his head. That is how you would say today. Bullshit. The boy laughed despite himself, and then his face grew serious. You mustn't be so shy with me, the vampire said. What is it? The story about stakes through the heart, said the boy, his cheeks coloring slightly. The same, said the vampire. Bullshit, he said, carefully articulating both syllables, so that the boy smiled. No magical power whatsoever. Why don't you smoke one of your cigarettes? I see you have them in your shirt pocket. Oh, thank you, said the boy, as if it were a marvelous suggestion. But once he had the cigarette to his lips, his hands were trembling so badly that he mangled the first fragile book match. Allow me, said the vampire, and taking the book, he quickly put a lighted match to the boy's cigarette. The boy inhaled, his eyes on the vampire's fingers. Now the vampire withdrew across the table with a soft rustling of garments. There's an ashtray on the basin, he said, and the boy moved nervously to get it. He stared at the few butts in it for a moment, and then, seeing the small wastebasket beneath them, he emptied the ashtray and quickly set it on the table. His fingers were damp on the cigarette, and when he put it down, Is this your room? He asked. No, answered the vampire. Just a room. What happened then? The boy asked. The vampire appeared to be watching the smoke gather beneath the overhead bulb. Ah, we went back to New Orleans post-haste, he said. Lestat had his coffin in a miserable room near the ramparts. And did you get into the coffin? I had no choice. I begged Lestat to let me stay in the closet, and he laughed, astonished. Don't you know what you are? He asked. But is it magical? Must it have this shape? I pleaded, only to hear him laugh again. I couldn't bear the idea, but as we argued, I realized I had no real fear. It was all strange realization. All my life I'd feared closed places, born and bred in French houses with lofty ceilings and floor-length windows. I had a dread of being enclosed. I felt uncomfortable even in the confessional in church. It was a normal enough fear, and now I realized as I protested to Lestat, I did not actually feel this anymore. I simply was remembering it, hanging on to it from habit, from a deficiency of ability to recognize my present and exhilarating freedom. You're carrying on badly, Lestat said finally, and it's almost dawn. I should let you die. You will die, you know. The sun will destroy the blood I've given you, in every tissue, every vein, but you shouldn't be feeling this fear at all. I think you're like a man who loses an arm or a leg and keeps insisting that he can feel pain where the arm or leg used to be. Well, that was positively the most intelligent and useful thing Lestat ever said to me in my presence, and it brought me around at once. Now, I'm getting into the coffin, he said, finally, to me in his most disdainful tone, "and you will get in on top of me if you know what's good for you." And I did. I laid face down on him, utterly confused by my absence of dread and filled with a distaste for being so close to him. Handsome and intriguing though he was, and he shut the lid. And then I asked him if I was completely dead. My body was tingling and itching all over. "No, you're not then," he said. "When you are, you'll only hear and see it changing and feeling nothing. You should be dead by tonight. Go to sleep." Was he right? Were you dead when you woke up? Yes, changed, I should say, as obviously I am alive. My body was dead. It was some time before it became absolutely cleansed of the fluids and matter it no longer needed, but it was dead. And with the realization of it came another stage in my divorce from human emotions. The first thing which became apparent to me, even while Lestat and I were loading the coffin into a hearse and stealing another coffin from a monastery, was that I did not like Lestat at all. I was far from being his equal, yet I was infinitely closer to him than I had been before the death of my body. I can't really make this clear to you, for the obvious reason that you are now as I was before my body died. You cannot understand, but before I died, Lestat was absolutely the most overwhelming experience I'd ever had. Your cigarette has become one long cylindrical ash. "Oh!" The boy quickly ground the filter into the glass. "You mean that when the gap was closed between you, he lost his spell?" he asked, his eyes quickly fixed on the vampire, his hands now producing a cigarette and match much more easily than before. "Yes, that's correct," said the vampire with obvious pleasure. "The trip back to Pont de Lac was thrilling, and the constant chatter of Lestat was positively the most boring and disheartening thing I experienced. Of course, as I said, I was far from being his equal. I had my dead limbs to contend with, to use his comparison, and I had learned that on that very night when I had to make my first kill." The vampire reached across the table now and gently brushed the ash from the boy's lapel, and the boy stared at his withdrawing hand in alarm. "Excuse me," said the vampire. "I didn't mean to frighten you." "Excuse me," said the boy. "I just got the impression suddenly that your arm was abnormally long. You reached so far without moving." "No," said the vampire, resting his hand again on his crossed knees. "I moved forward much too fast for you to see. It was an illusion." "You moved forward? But you didn't. You were sitting just as you are now, with your back against the chair." "No," repeated the vampire firmly. "I moved forward as I told you. Here, I'll do it again." And he did it again, and the boy stared with the same mixture of confusion and fear. "You still didn't see it," said the vampire. "But you see, if you look at my outstretched arm now, it's really not remarkably long at all." And he raised his arm, first finger pointing heavenward, as if he were an angel about to give the word of the Lord. "You have experienced a fundamental difference between my way of seeing and the way you see." My gesture appeared slow and somewhat languid to me, and the sound of my finger brushing your coat was quite audible. "Well, I didn't mean to frighten you, I confess. But perhaps you can see this, that my return to Pont de Lac was a feast of new experiences, the mere swaying of a tree branch in the wind, a delight." "Yes," the boy said, but he was still visibly shaken. The vampire eyed him for a moment, and then he said, I was telling you about your first kill, said the boy. Yes, I should say first. However, that the plantation was in a state of pandemonium. The overseer's body had been found, and so had the blind old man in the master's bedroom, and no one could explain the blind old man's presence, and no one had been able to find me in New Orleans. My sister had contacted the police, and several of them were at Pont de Lac when I arrived. It was already quite dark, naturally, and Lestat quickly explained to me that I must not let the police see me even minimal light, especially not with my body in its present remarkable state. So I talked to them in the avenue of the oaks before the plantation house, ignoring their requests that we go inside. I explained I'd been to Pont de Lac the night before, and the blind old man was my guest. As for the overseer, he had not been here, but had gone to New Orleans on business. After that was settled, during which my new detachment served me admirably, I had the problem of the plantation itself. My slaves were in a state of complete confusion. No work had been done all day. We had a large plant then for the making of the indigo dye, and the overseer's management had been most important. But I had several extreme intelligent slaves who might have done his job just as well a long time before if I had recognized their intelligence and not feared their African appearance and manner. I studied them clearly now and gave the management of things over to them. To the best, I gave the overseer's house on a promise. 2 of the young women were brought back to the house in the fields to care for Lestat's father, and I told them I wanted as much privacy as possible, and they would all of them be rewarded not only for service for leaving me and Lestat absolutely alone. I did not realize at the time these slaves would be the first and possibly the only ones ever to suspect that Lestat and I were not ordinary creatures. I failed to realize that their experience with the supernatural was far greater than that of white men. In my own inexperience, I still thought of them as childlike savages, barely domesticated by slavery. I made a bad mistake, but let them keep to my story. I was going to tell you about my first kill. Lestat bungled it with his characteristic lack of common sense. Bungled it? Asked the boy. I should have never started with human beings, but this was something I had to learn by myself. Lestat had plunged us headlong into the swamps right after the police and the slaves were settled. It was very late, and the slave cabins were completely dark. We soon lost sight of the lights of Pont de Lac altogether, and I became very agitated. It was the same thing again. Remembered fears, confusion. Lestat, had he any native intelligence, might have explained things to me patiently and gently. That I had no need to fear the swamps, that to snakes and instincts I was utterly invulnerable, and that I must concentrate on my new abilities to see in total darkness. Instead, he harassed me with condemnations. He was concerned only with our victims, with finishing my initiation and getting on with it. And when we finally came upon our victims, he rushed me into action. They were a small camp of runaway slaves. Lestat had visited them before and picked off perhaps 1/4 of their number by watching from the dark for the one of them to leave the fire, or by taking them in their sleep. They knew absolutely nothing of Lestat's presence. We had to watch for well over an hour before one of the men, they were all men, finally left the clearing and came just a few paces into the trees. He unhooked his pants now and attended to an ordinary physical necessity. And as he turned to go, Lestat shook me and said, "Take him." The vampire smiled at the boy's wide eyes. "I think I was about as horror-struck as you would be," he said. But I didn't know then that I might kill animals instead of humans, I said quickly. I could not possibly take him. And the slave heard me speak. He turned his back to the distant fire and peered into the dark, and then quickly and silently he drew his long knife out of his belt. He was naked except for the pants and the belt, a tall, strong-armed, sleek young man. He said something in French patois, and then he stepped forward. I realized, though I saw him clearly in the dark, he could not see us. Lestat stepped in from behind him with a swiftness that baffled me and got a hold around his neck while he pinned his left arm. The slave cried out and tried to throw Lestat off. He sank his teeth now, and the slave froze as if from a snake bite. He sank to his knees, and Lestat fed fast as the other slaves came running. "You sicken me," he said. When he got back to me, it was as if we were black insects, utterly camouflaged in the night, watching the slaves move, oblivious to us, to discover the wounded man, drag him back, fan out the foliage, searching for the attacker. "Come on! We have to get another one before they all return to camp," he said, and quickly we set off after one man who was separated from the others. I was still terribly agitated, convinced I couldn't bring myself to attack, and feeling no urge to do so. There were many things, as I mentioned, which Lestat might have said and done. He might have made the experience rich in so many ways, but he did not. "What could he have done?" the boy asked. "What do you mean?" "Killing is no ordinary act," said the vampire. "One doesn't simply glut oneself on blood." He shook his head. "It is the experience of another's life for certain, and often the experience of loss of that life through the blood slowly. It is again and again the experience of that loss of my own life which I experienced when I sucked the blood from Lestat's wrist and felt his heart pound with my heart. It is again and again a celebration of that experience, because for vampires that is the ultimate experience." He said this most seriously, as if he were arguing with someone who held a different view. I don't think Lestat ever appreciated that, though how could he not? I don't know. Let me say he appreciated something, but very little, I think, of what there is to know. In any event, he took no pains to remind me now of what I'd felt when I clamped onto his wrist, for life itself wouldn't let it go, or to pick and choose a place for me where I might experience my first kill with some measure of quiet and dignity. He rushed headlong through the encounter as if it were something to put behind us as quickly as possible, like so many yards of the road. Once he had caught the slave, he gagged him and held him, baring his neck. "Do it," he said. "You can't turn back now." Overcome with revulsion and weak with frustration, I obeyed. I knelt beside the bent, struggling man and clamped both my hands onto his shoulders. I went into his neck. My teeth had only just begun to change, and I had to tear his flesh, not puncture it. But once the wound was made, the blood flowed. And once it happened, once I was locked to it, drinking, all else vanished. Lestat and the swamp and the noise of the distant camp meant nothing. Lestat might have been an insect, buzzing, lighting, and then vanishing in significance.